Hey, thankful to see you here this morning. Grateful, very grateful for another opportunity we have to meet together and think together about important things, about eternal things. We began a study here recently, a very fundamental study about the existence of God. And it's not so much that perhaps I'm talking today to a room full of atheists, but it is a fact that unbelief, that atheism, is more prevalent now in our society than it's ever been in my lifetime. And it's an important question. And the influence of this world tends to move us away from the truth and to lure us by lies into areas where, frankly, it would have us join them in their misery. It is an important question, isn't it? You know, Rodney in his prayer mentioned about the hope of heaven. That, I trust, is the hope of every one of us here today. We don't have a hope of heaven because we are flawless, because we need not be forgiven. We have a hope because we are forgiven and because God does love us and because He asks nothing of me that I cannot give Him. And so with that in mind, there is a hope that carries us through. We sang about being happy. And yet I doubt anybody in this room doesn't have some care on their heart, some pain to deal with, some issues to deal with, maybe multiple issues. But we still have a joy. And the reason for that is because we know God. It makes all the difference. We said in an earlier lesson that the big questions of life, questions about, who are we? And where did we come from? And where are we going? And what are we supposed to be doing while we're here? Those fundamental questions that men can distract themselves from with work, pursuing things, drunkenness, lust, whatever it might be that keeps people from thinking about what's serious. But there are those hours in the day, maybe early in the morning, when we wake up to the reality that we are living a hopeless, empty existence. If there is no God, there is no other alternative. But if there is a God, then it changes everything about our life, and it makes our life worth living. And I don't care who we are, how long we've been at this thing. Keeping that foundation solid is critically important to making this life count and to being prepared for what's next. So we do ask the question, does God exist? And we search for answers and remind ourselves of the reason and the reasonableness of faith, not just for our young people, though it's certainly for them, but for all of us. What amazes me, and I'm sure you as well, as a believer, is how many smart people make such foolish remarks about whether or not it's reasonable to believe in God. One fellow said, I'm an atheist because there is no evidence for the existence of God. That should be all that needs to be said about it. No evidence, no belief. No evidence for the existence of God. I marvel at, and I've heard this from different sources. Intelligent people who say there's just no evidence for God. And when I hear that, well, a lot of thoughts come to mind, but one of them is, I wonder if they've ever seen it rain. You've never seen rain? Never heard about rain? That's just one simple example of a marvel that God has created. You know, I didn't major in earth science, but I think any of us understand that the water that comes down, been coming down a lot recently, here where we live, that kind of water comes largely from the oceans as they evaporate. And there's this cycle of the evaporation of this salt water. And then it's distilled through the atmosphere and it falls down and waters the crops that keep us fed and keep us from starving to death and that bless men and animals. And you think about the marvel of that system. And then you wonder, well, where did that come from? And the book of Job, thousands of years ago, Job was asked the question by God, who makes rain fall where no one lives? Who waters the dry and thirsty land so that grass springs up? Does either the rain or the dew have a father? Great question. No evidence for God. The evidence is all around us. We looked in a previous lesson about the first of 4 points concerning the evidences for God that are obvious. We said then, and we'll say again, it's not enough for many of those we're going to talk to and meet to say, well, Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's exactly right. And I believe the Bible. But for those who have been taught that the Bible is a myth and that there's no rational evidence that moves us to look for God, we have to talk to those folks too. And so on that basis, we can look at our surroundings and we can see the evidences of God just as the Bible indicates all around us. One of them is just simply the evidence, the existence, I should say, of the universe as an evidence for God. Why is there something instead of nothing? There has to be a first cause. The technical term for this sometimes is the cosmological argument. Cosmos is the Greek word for order, and it's used then and now for the order of the whole universe. Where did all this come from? This syllogism has been used a lot of times. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. If there's a beginning, something caused that. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause, a first cause. Another way to put it is, creation is itself evidence for a creator. What sense does it make to talk about creation and deny the creator? About as much sense as it makes talking about a house but denying the existence of house builders. Every house was built by someone. And He that made all things is God. This is a fundamental. Intelligent people will say there's no evidence for God. Look around and see what God has made and know that God exists. We talked about that at a greater length earlier. But I want to talk about this morning another aspect of this idea of evidences for God. Not just that things exist, but the design of those things cries out for a designer. A technical term for this sometimes is the teleological argument. Another one of those Greek words. Telos suggests the idea of that which through purpose has been designed to achieve a certain goal. So it's the idea of design. Looking around us and seeing the design of creation cries out for an intelligent, purposeful, wise creator. Every design had a designer. The universe has a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe had a designer. That is, to my mind, self-evident. Going back to the prophet Isaiah, all those years ago, 2,700 years ago, was writing about the stars. And he wrote, "To whom then will you compare me?" God speaking through Isaiah here. "That I should be like him, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of His might, and because He is strong in power, not one is missing." Who has set up this system whereby, as it were, He calls the stars out every night? I've used this illustration before, and you'll forgive me for repeating myself. But, I don't know much about art. I enjoy looking at it. I enjoy learning about it. You go to a museum and you see these very famous works of art. Maybe it's a landscape. Or, maybe it's some sort of even of a night scene. And here's an artist who's painting this scene for you. Not a photograph, but this comes from the mind of the artist. Somebody told me one time, when you're looking at a painting in a museum, one thing that you can do to help you appreciate it more, get more out of it is, if it's a landscape, for example, look and see how many figures that you see there. Count them. If you've got a group of people, maybe it's a rural scene and people are out gathering a harvest, Count each and every one. If you don't count them, you don't see them. See them and count them. And then consider the fact that every one of those people, or maybe it's a night scene, every one of those stars was put there by the artist. And there's a purpose there. I may not be able to tell you exactly what the purpose is, but none of it was accidental or incidental. It was all purposeful. And in just looking at a human creation, we need to notice all of what's put in it. Well, as far as we can, as far as we're able, looking at what God has made reminds us of the greatness and the wisdom, the purpose, the design of its designer. And you know, I live in an area that's just filled with light pollution. I live on a highway by a bunch of warehouses, and so you'd never have dark. But I've been in places where it got dark. In West Virginia, on those mountains up there, you know, we used to do some appointment preaching at this congregation way out in the country in West Virginia. And coming back, Donna and I would always stop on this road and just take a minute to look at the sky. And I hear that in places like Arizona, I've never been out west, there are places like that where it's just far from light made by men. And you can just see the sky on a different level. Indeed. When you do that, you see the handiwork of a creator, of a designer. Isaac Newton was once quoted as saying, "The most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, the comets, could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." You know, sometimes we maybe have heard so much propaganda from unbelievers that we tend to think that only people who don't know much believe in God, but really smart, educated people, well, they all have dismissed God as just a useless myth. That's not so. Actually, it's never been so. And when I see the name Isaac Newton, does he qualify as a scientist? He certainly was a believer in God. I'm not saying that you and I would agree with every conclusion he had about the Bible. But he certainly was a man who saw enough to convince him that God is. And I think when you look at the names of science, whether it be Faraday or Max Planck or Kepler or Mendel or any of those names we learned in science when we were in school, giants in the fields of whether it be chemistry or botany or whatever, astronomy or genetics, all of these people in all these fields had a deep, abiding belief in God. I think the atheist scientists, or people who think that the religion and science are incompatible, that's a fairly modern view of things, and a misview of it. Let me share a name that you may not have heard, not as famous as Isaac Newton, but famous in his own field. This is a guy named James Tour. Maybe you've seen him along some video of his or some part of a speech that he made. Now Tour is quite an accomplished fellow. He still, as far as I know, is based at Rice University, which is a pretty highly respected academic school down in Texas. And he is, if you just look on their website, he was listed as a professor of chemistry, professor of material science, nanoengineering, and computer science. I'm not even smart enough to know what nanoengineering is. I don't think. I had to look it up, but I think that's the idea of people who work on a subatomic level with impossibly small forces, figuring out how they might be, how they work, how they might be manipulated for the purposes of engineering, the purposes of medicine, or whatever it might be. He's a brilliant fellow. To be an expert in one of those fields would be extraordinary. To be an expert in all these fields, I don't know how many folks in the world could make a statement like that. He also happens to be a very convicted believer in God. And this is just a part of a larger quote where he talks about how that, you know, in dealing with what he deals with, he understands the idea of recognizing design and learning how to work with that design in order to accomplish certain purposes. There's nothing random about this. And he said on that basis, only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it'll bring you closer to God. He's talking about rookies. There are plenty of those in the world. Some of them teach 8th grade biology. Some of them are on TikTok. And they just rather summarily dismiss the idea of God like they know everything. But people who claim they know everything don't know near as much as they ought to know. And the real knowledgeable people that we meet in our life are people who know their own limits. But recognizing God is so fundamental with people who truly know that to them it's just unthinkable to dismiss the designer of all the design that we see. Even if you don't know anything about nanoscience, we understand what design is. We see an artist, we were mentioning that earlier, who paints a painting. We know good and well when I go in the museum and see that painting, that did not happen by itself. There was work put into that. There was thought put into that. There's artistry in art, whether that art be on a computer, whether it be in some sort of materials. There's design, and it demands a designer. We think about that in reference to certain machines and mechanics. The illustration has been used many times. The reality of the watch demands a watchmaker. That's an old argument, but I've never heard it accurately and fully answered. Anybody who's got a wristwatch on, even if it doesn't have a name telling you the maker, knows it was made by somebody. And that's so. I tell you, you think a wristwatch or even a pocket watch is intricate, and it is. You open it up and look at it. I don't know what all those parts are doing or what that movement's about. I tell you, compared to an automobile, for example, a watch is pretty simple. Our automobiles today, and more every day, have so many complex parts. And there are people who have learned through experience and through training how that machine works. But I've never met anybody, any mechanic, who ever had the idea that maybe the car just made itself. Maybe nobody actually made this car. There may be some cars so pitiful that the manufacturer wishes that you'd believe they didn't make them. But somebody made them. The design demands that to be so. But compared to a space shuttle, a car is a very simple thing, isn't it? We've got machines now that can be shot up into space, manned by human beings. And they can spend some time in orbit, and then they can fly back into the atmosphere and land safely and return to Earth. I'm old enough to remember the first moon landing when I was a kid. And then we've seen the space program go through so many different phases. But it's extraordinary to think about the complexity of a machine that's able to accomplish what was barely dreamed of when my grandparents were young. It takes thousands of components to allow a human being to survive in space. It's a delicate procedure. I know, again, I've told some of you this story. I've only been on the campus down at Florida College, a college that's run by and staffed largely by our brethren, not a church-sponsored college, but certainly the influence is there of Christians. I've only been on that campus one time, and I was in a training program in West Virginia, and the fellow that I was studying under, he and I and several other fellows jammed up in a car and made our way from West Virginia down to Florida. Now, the lectures at that time, I guess they still are, they started on it seems like on a Monday night, and then Tuesday all-day lectures, and then the night, and then Wednesday different classes, and then so that went on through the week. It was a busy week. But it was decided by the other fellows we would go down early because we found out that it just so happened the day before the lecture started in earnest, that early that Monday, they were scheduled to launch a space shuttle mission. Now, Tampa's on one side of Florida and Cape Canaveral's on the other. But these fellas, I wasn't driving, so I was okay. They said, yeah, we're going to come down, we're going to go over there, we're going to park somewhere where you can see, because you can see from a long distance, Cape Canaveral. And we're going to watch that thing take off, then we'll come over and get ready for the lectures Monday night. So we worked that plan. The only problem was it was supposed to go off at 10 in the morning. It didn't. 10:30 it didn't. 11 it didn't. And finally they announced on the radio, it's just too cold today. We're going to have to do it tomorrow. Well, missed my chance. So we went to the lectures, and the next day we were in the lecture hall, and between lectures somebody announced that the Challenger had exploded. That was the Challenger sitting there. But they went ahead and launched it the next day. And one of those, or maybe one or two of those thousands of components did not function properly. And the result was destruction. Turned out to be a little O-ring. You may remember that story. Some of you guys, I know, is before your time. But it was a seal, quite large actually, but a seal that malfunctioned, that caused fuel to leak, that caused an explosion. They didn't even make it to outer space. But when they do make it to outer space, imagine all the components it takes to keep human beings alive in outer space. And everything that's got to work in order for that to happen. We all maybe remember hearing about Apollo 13, where there was a crew that got up there and was stranded because of mechanical failure, and they got them back. That was quite a long time ago, 1970 or something like that. Anyway, the point is, it's an extraordinary thing. If you think that just keeping a crew alive on a space shuttle in the cold black of space is an amazing thing, and it is, imagine what it's like to keep this whole planet safe. And for everything that it takes in order for the earth to be suitable and habitable for human life and animal life. The extraordinary design of the planet, and you've probably read things along this line, and there are folks who can speak better to it, but the fine-tuning of the earth, to say that that's an accident is somehow outrageous. The oxygen levels have to be just right. Otherwise, human life could not exist. The moon and the earth being in proper relationship to each other is a delicate balance. I knew a dear older lady who grew up in the country, a good woman, but she was interested in space. But when they started landing on the moon, I remember her saying, I wish they would quit messing with the moon. She said, we need it for the tides. Well, that's one way to look at it. But she was right about that. You know, we do need the moon for a lot of things. That relationship is important. And if it were not just so, life on Earth would be dramatically affected. The Earth's crust has to be a certain perfect measurement. If it's too thick, too thin, life would be extinguished. The Earth's rotation is just balanced properly to sustain life so that the temperature doesn't get too great or be so low as to extinguish life. The tilt of the earth. I can remember reading this as a schoolboy. You know, the earth is tilted at a certain axis, 23 degrees tilt. If it were different, then life couldn't exist. Everything that you can think of. The distance to the sun is just so. You know, if it was any further away, we'd freeze. If it was any closer, we'd burn up. Tell me how all this happens. This perfect balance, this design with no designer. There's no evidence for God. Okay. Well, maybe we're just not looking at it. There's a book written several years ago by a guy named Hugh Ross. He was an astrophysicist. And he said more than a theory, the idea of God is more than a theory. And he said, looking at some of the things we've talked about and others, all the delicate balance that's necessary for life to exist on this earth. He calculated the probability that these and other constants, 122 in all, would exist today on any planet in the universe by chance. How likely is it that all of these things could exist by chance? And the answer he came up with through mathematical formula was 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power, not being a math major. What that means is that you take a 1 and then you put 138 zeros behind it. That's your chance of this being an accident. Even that's not enough to help me. So I began to think about numbers. We throw around maybe words like million. It's a million. Our government can spend $1 million in about 5 minutes, can't they? Million. You know how long it would take a person if I were just today to right now begin counting to 1 million? I want you to wait while I count to 1 million. It would take 11 days, 13 hours, and 46 minutes and 40 seconds. If I didn't take a break, it would take 11 and a half days to count from 1 to 1 million. That's how big 1 million is. But then we hear words like trillion. To do that same thing, to count to 1 trillion, it would take 79 years. That's how big 1 trillion is. That's how much money people spend, trillions of dollars. You couldn't count that much of $1 bills in 79 years. But that's nothing compared to the number we're talking about. You cannot count to 10 to the 138th power in 1 trillion years. If you counted, it would be impossible to do so because the size of this number is so great. In other words, when he says that the chances of this being random are 1 to the 138th power, what he's really saying is it's impossible. There's a fellow named John Lennox that you may have run across at some point. Mr. Lennox is a mathematics professor, or was at Cambridge. I think he has resigned. I take it back, Oxford, I believe it was. He resigned, retired, I should say. But for years he was there. He was also a very strong believer. And he would go and debate these atheists on what he called intelligent design. He wasn't even trying so much to argue for the God of the Bible and all that the Bible says. He was just arguing with people who said that there is no creator, no designer, thus no God. So anyway, Mr. Lennox would debate these folks. I got to hear him in Birmingham, down at Samford. He was debating Christopher Hitchens, a famous atheist. This has been probably 20 years ago. And so they had the exchange there, and then there was a question-answer period. And somebody asked Mr. Lennox during that period, you are professor at Oxford, you are a believer. Are there other believers at Oxford? And he made a comment something along this line. He said, oh yes, there are a number of us. He said, especially in the math department. He said, because the truth is that when you look at the arguments and you do the math, and people try to suggest from biology or some of these other fields that, well, actually, existence and life and all these things could have happened by accident. He said, we know the numbers and we know better. I thought that was a good point. I say this to say to our young folks, when you hear all the bluster and bravado from unbelievers, understand that they're selling an empty sack. And the truth is that belief in God is not foolish. In fact, it's the only explanation that makes any sense. When you see design, you see a designer. Just as surely as when you see a watch, you know, whether you ever meet him or see a picture of him, you know that there was a watchmaker. And that's why when Paul in Romans chapter 1 writes about the very foundation of our faith. It's a book about salvation, isn't it? But at the bottom of that is faith in God. That's the foundation we stand on. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. The truth he's talking about in particular is the existence of a Creator to whom we are accountable. He continues, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." Look at the stars. The heavens declare the glory of God. And if we don't want to see that, it's precisely because we don't want to see that. Although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. That's what I think about these folks. They're not stupid. They're not unintelligent. But they talk foolishness. And it's not an information problem. It's a will problem. That's something to keep in mind before we join up with that crowd or are too deeply impressed with their rhetoric. Everybody that's intelligent believes in God. Not so. Never been so. Let me mention one more illustration along that line. I don't know how many of our young folks have ever heard of John Glenn, but certainly if you're my age or older, you remember John Glenn. He was a great American hero. He was a Marine Corps pilot who got into the space program when it was brand new. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. He did that in the 1960s. And then he went on to be a senator from Ohio for more than 15 years or something like that. And then, as an older man, he was called back and given the privilege of going on one of the space shuttle missions. So he had quite a life. Brilliant, brave, all those things that we think of in terms of a hero. But he made this comment after his last space mission, and it's striking. He said, "To look out at this creation and not believe in God is to me impossible." That says it well. It seems to me impossible. It only is it possible if we are willfully ignorant. Design demands a designer, and the design of the universe is the mark of its creator. Psalm 103 and verse 11, we'll close here. For the psalmist, 3,000 years ago wrote, "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is His steadfast love toward those who fear Him." When you see the psalmist says the vastness of the universe, one thing you ought to be reminded of is the vastness of God's love for you and for me. That's a great note to end on. If you're here this morning and you desire to be a child of God, He calls you, He wants you, will you come? If you're here as one who has a child of God, has strayed from Him, return to Him today. If there's some way, any way we can help you in that, let us know how you might come to the loving God right now while we stand.